director of the Do No Harm project. And in these videos, we're going through the Do No Harm frameworks. This video is about the action framework, the second Do No Harm framework. Since 2006, the Do No Harm project has been visiting people who've been involved in the project over the years, since the early 90s, asking people how they actually used Do No Harm. Did Do No Harm make any difference in the way in which they actually did their work? Happily, the answer is yes. But the relationship framework, which we detailed in our previous video, people said that was an effective way to teach them the principles, not, however, what they actually used in practice. In the action framework, people still generate lists of dividers and connectors. So in the action framework, people are still looking at the context. They're looking at what are the elements in that context that matter to their intervention. They look at the dividers and the connectors. In the action framework, they also track the change over time of dividers and connectors. They ask, are they getting better or worse? Some people ask themselves whether things are getting better or worse. They see the change in the dividers and connectors in the action. And then they say, what can we do about that? They look for options or opportunities. Some people have looked at the context, looked at dividers and connectors, seen the change. How are they changing? Are they getting better or worse? What can we do about it? What are our options in this situation? What are our opportunities here? The word opportunities was introduced as people started to talk about how they thought options was generally about negatives. That if we saw a divider or a connector was getting worse, then we wanted options. People wanted another word to use for better. If we saw positive change or we saw opportunities for positive change, let's think about opportunities in that situation. Not just options, opportunities. So following what people's language that they actually used, they said we think about dividers and connectors. Are they better or worse? What are our options and our opportunities? And then once they think about what can we do, then they put that into action. So people go through this cycle here. Look at the context, look at change over time, what can we do about it, put it into action. The next step in the cycle, of course, is to go back and review the context again. One of the complaints that people had about the relationship framework was that it seemed very static. You would do it once, you would fill it out, and then you were done. You didn't have an incentive or an impetus to go through it another time. This framework, drawn as a circle, as a loop, actually carries you through the steps. And as people who have used Do No Harm on a regular basis, who use it in their daily work, they say that they need that sense of carrying themselves through. How do we take the ideas and just push ourselves through them again and again? So that cycle, the context, the change, what do we do about it, put it into practice, review the context again. How often do people do this? Some people do this on a weekly basis. Some are doing this on a daily basis of going through this cycle of reviewing the context, the change, what can we do about it, putting that into action every single day. The resource transfers and implicit ethical messages. Where are they? They're still in here. Let me show you. As people look at the change, they see that the change falls into patterns. This is exactly the same as the relationship framework, that the change of any intervention falls into certain patterns of how resources and the behaviors, the messages of behavior, interact with the context. We see change in the context, we see them fall into the patterns of the resource transfers and implicit ethical messages. When we come to thinking about our options and our opportunities, we need to make use of those patterns. The patterns help us to see how this change can take place either in negative impacts or in positive impacts. When we follow the patterns, we're developing options that are referring directly to the change. By the same token, with the resource transfers and the messages over here on this side, if we've come up with an option, if we've developed a new opportunity, we need to check to see if they're following the patterns. Have we made use of the resource transfers and the messages in order to develop our options and our opportunities? We can here, at this point, develop all sorts of new ideas, new policies, new practices, new interventions that would maybe be more efficient, more effective in some ways. But do no harm is about our relationship to the context and the context of conflict. If we're not following the patterns, if we're not making use of the patterns, we're not being conflict sensitive. An option, in order to be conflict sensitive, needs to have taken account of how we see this change taking place through the resources and the implicit ethical messages. We develop an option, we need to make sure that we've done that. So there's a bit of a double checking process here with the patterns. As people make use of this in their daily practice, one other difference with the relationship framework really should be highlighted here. As people said about the relationship framework, it shows the relationship of our interaction, our intervention. How does that play out in that context of conflict? But we're not the only actor in that situation. The relationship framework made it seem as though we were the only actor, that it was what we did that mattered, and the only thing that mattered was what we were doing. Obviously, people said that this is not true. We are not the only actors. As we look at dividers and connectors and we look at the change, that change can be either through our own action or it can be change that comes about from outside actors. Outside forces can also be causing change in the situation. That does not absolve us of the responsibility of developing options and opportunities. Just as we watch our own interactions create change and we look at the patterns that we are playing into, we can also see how other forces are playing into the change. We can see how those patterns are being made use of, or how those patterns are playing out based upon what they are doing. And we can still develop options and opportunities in those situations. One last thing about the action framework is we've talked to the people who go through this process, this cycle, on a regular basis. They talk about how they get better and better at it the more often they go through it. That process, starting with looking at what the context is, tracking change, which is crucial, developing options, putting those options into practice, and then checking against the context again. No one is an expert the first time through that cycle. No one's really an expert the second time either. But that process of doing it on a regular basis means that we have a constant feedback, seeing whether we actually are getting it right. Every time we look at this list, we look at the change, we come up with an option and see what we do and how the change then comes about from our action. Then we know whether or not we've actually done something because we're actually tracking that. Is our action having an impact in that situation? Just as well, the more often we go through it, the better we are able to see which change is coming from outside actors. We begin to be able to differentiate between the change from us, the change from outside. The action framework is the way that users of do no harm are actually using do no harm, putting it into practice. Every time through this cycle is a learning opportunity. One thing about do no harm is that it promotes constant reflection, constant learning. This cycle embodies that. People every day, all over the world, are using this to make their programs better.